It's not irregular to eat 100 to 150 grams of carbohydrate for a lot of people. That might be out there for our, our listeners, but a lot of people are taking that in and not blinking an eye. And they might be healthy carbs like fruits and oatmeal and yogurt, juice even, but your body's like, the blood sugar goes high. Your body's going to do everything it can to regulate that.
Do you feel like your blood sugar is okay, but you're still experiencing a lot of symptoms of blood sugar dysregulation? Well, our guest today, Shana Hussin, is going to talk to us all about how our blood sugar could actually be okay, but our insulin could be rising for years before we actually see a change in our blood sugar. Oftentimes, this is missed by our doctors because they're not testing us for our fasting insulin numbers. And so we can feel like we're being gaslit, or we could feel like, oh, I guess it's not my blood sugar, when really it is still your metabolic health. I'm so excited to dive into this episode. Welcome to the Unlock the Sugar Shackles podcast. Welcome back to the podcast. I'm so excited to have you here with me today. My name is Danny, and if this is your first time, welcome. And if you are returning, thanks so much for coming back. I know there's so many options of podcasts and YouTube videos to listen to, and so it really, really means a lot to me that you are here and you're taking your health into your own hands. I'm really excited to dive into the interview that I did with my good friend, Shana Hussin. She is a registered dietitian nutritionist, and she's also a fasting and weight loss expert. She has a book called Fast to Heal. Her podcast is also called Fast to Heal, and she helps people get over that weight loss plateau and really helps them find optimal metabolic health so they can improve their body composition. So we do a lot of the same things, and that's why I love talking to her, because we're very like-minded and we work with a lot of the same kind of people struggling with these metabolic issues. I'm really excited to dive into our conversation today, where we're going to learn how insulin can be rising for years before we see a change in our blood sugar. We're going to talk about what numbers you want to see for insulin, how you can test these things. We're going to talk about protocols for fasting, benefits of fasting, when you should fast and shouldn't, strategies that Shana uses to help her clients overcome insulin resistance, and so much more. This interview is chock full of information. You are going to love it. Make sure you check out Shana's information. All of it is linked in the show notes, where you can listen to her podcast, connect with her on social, and so much more. Let's dive into the interview. Shana, I'm so excited to welcome you to the Unlock the Sugar Shackles podcast.
Thanks. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. Thanks for having me today.
Yeah, so excited. So we talk about a lot of similar things, and I love hearing other people's perspectives on how to explain these things, and just to have a conversation where we can geek out on one of my favorite subjects. And I would love to first start with your story and how you got into things about insulin resistance, because I used to hear that stuff and I would just kind of glaze over because it felt really boring and confusing and like, oh, that doesn't pertain to me. I don't really know what it is. And so how did you get into this wonderful world of insulin resistance?
Yeah, I would glaze over too, and I'm a registered dietitian, so that's really kind of sad. But yeah, I'm a conventionally trained dietitian, so I've been in this space for a long time. This is actually my 23rd year, but I've just been in about the last 5 to 6 years that I couldn't teach in that realm any longer, because I couldn't teach what I actually knew to be true and heal people. So I left and went out on my own about 5 or 6 years ago. But yeah, early on, I've always worked mainly in the weight management field. And early on, like, I didn't know any better. We were, telling people to eat low fat and eat, the PUFAs and the seed oils and all of the things that we know that are really inflammatory, and lots of grains and lots of carbs. And I couldn't understand. About 10 years in, I'm like, nobody's getting better. The obesity epidemic is getting worse. Diabetes is getting worse. No one wants to come back and see me because no one's getting better, and they're, stacking more and more medications. I'm like, at first I thought it was just the people not following through with what I was recommending. And then I thought, oh, maybe it's me. Like, I don't know. Maybe I'm not teaching what actually helps people. And that really bothered me. And about that same time, I was struggling with my own health issues. I was bloated all the time, despite, following the standard recommendations and eating a lot of healthy whole grains and eating from the time I got up in the morning and, having lots of snacks and basically some days eating till I went to bed at night. And it was always healthy food, but it was a handful here, a handful there, and lots of grains that my body did not tolerate well at all. And so I had three kids in there, and my middle son, when he was 10, got super ill. And we were kind of thrown into the conventional system, which we'd never really been there before. We were a healthy family, other than well child visits and that sort of thing. And all of a sudden, I started asking questions to his conventional gastroenterologist that they couldn't answer. They didn't want to answer. They didn't want me, asking the questions. They didn't want me, they didn't have answers for me. He was actually diagnosed with ulcerative colitis, which is a horrible inflammatory bowel disease, and we could not get it under control. And he went from being completely healthy to being very ill within a couple of weeks. And all of the natural treatment methods that I was, looking at and questioning were, they're kind of like you can do that on your own, but we don't support it kind of thing. And when one medication wouldn't work, they would just keep stacking them. Where pretty soon we were to infusion treatments that are like classified under chemotherapy, which really scared me as a mom. So I thought there's got to be a better way to this. So I started kind of going down every rabbit hole that there was. And I know that this was kind of your story too. I was looking at, vaccines and mold and nutrition and, anything that I could try to figure out what was triggering his illness, heavy metals, whatever it was. And during that time, I just did a deep dive in nutrition. I started to follow so many functional practitioners and really started to question the nutrition guidelines and where they were coming from. And I started to remove some of those grains and carbohydrates because it was recommended for him. And I'm like, well, I'm not making him do this alone. He was, we tried like no sugar, no grain, and our whole family adopted it. And I felt so much better doing that. So I thought, okay, there's way too many carbohydrates in my diet. So I started to improve my own health. His journey was much longer. That's a whole nother podcast. But I also started to hear about intermittent fasting and, fasting protocols. And I thought, that is crazy. Like everyone needs to eat as soon as they get up in the morning. That's not healthy. And I just started to try it on my own, N of one. And the healing that I saw was pretty significant pretty quickly. And I was never somebody who had a lot like weight issues. My weight was always pretty well managed, but I had a hard time maintaining it there. Like I was running all the time. I was, doing all the things. And yeah, it was managed, but I felt like, why am I going to have to work this hard my whole life? And at some point it's going to catch up with me because my mom and dad are obese. My sisters are obese. A lot of my extended family is obese. Like it's going to catch up with me at some point in time. And so once I adopted those strategies, I started to learn a whole lot about blood sugar because you would think as a dietitian, I would know a lot about blood sugar, but I didn't. And even diabetes educators, they're just kind of, they're told to dose, carbohydrates and, eat them strategically throughout the day in certain amounts and just keep dosing medications in response to whatever carbohydrates you're taking in, which looking back now, I know is absolutely crazy. But I just started to really get very intrigued and interested in insulin resistance. And then I found out about testing for insulin resistance, tested myself, and my insulin was really high. And well, I shouldn't say really high, it was like 10.7, which is definitely on the high side. But Danny, the funny part is this is 2 years after I had already been intermittent fasting and pulling carbs out of my diet.
Wow.
So I have no idea because I didn't know to test for it.
Same here.
Where, 4 or 5 years ago, I bet it was pretty high. Like, I want to say it might have even been double that because I was really struggling with being hungry all the time, thinking about food all the time, craving carbs and sugar, and just really struggling, thinking about food from the time I got up till the time I went to bed. So once I started to learn how to moderate my blood sugar and really did a deep dive into insulin resistance and how to reverse that, my insulin level last time, I haven't checked it since January, but it was 7.5. So it was still a little bit higher than what I would like. But my blood sugars, my triglycerides, all of those things are normal, so I'm not too concerned about it. But like I love uncovering insulin resistance for people, especially those, there's so many who need help with this. And I work very closely with a lot of people struggling with prediabetes, type 2 diabetes, and fatty liver. But there are so many people out there who were like me, had normal blood sugar, normal hemoglobin A1C, a healthy weight, but still struggling with insulin resistance. So that's how I got involved with what I'm doing now. And I just grew tired of the guidelines that weren't working anymore.
Yeah, I love hearing the transition from mainstream, and I sort of bash the mainstream medical system when it comes to blood sugar, and it's like this is another part of it, the dietitians, and it's not the people themselves, right? It's like you were just doing what you were taught, and it was good on you to figure out, okay, this isn't working. And then the natural thing is to think, well, I was taught this in a school, so it's got to be the other people. And then I think that's where a lot of people stop. A lot of doctors may stop. It's like, oh, my patients are non-compliant. But then you get those stories like the Ken Berries of the world, and they're like, well, I tried the advice on myself and it didn't work. And so all of a sudden we then know that we have to be questioning what we were taught. And so I think that's really amazing that you were able to come out of that, and through supporting your son. How's he doing now? Is he doing better?
He's great. Yeah.
Okay,
So
good.
he's now 18 and he's been
Okay.
in remission for like 3 years. But
Amazing.
it took a good 3 years to get him in remission. So
Wow.
it was a long journey, but I
Yeah.
feel that's why it happened. Like I would have
Yeah.
never gone down all of these roads and paths. So there's
Yeah.
always something that's
Something
coming,
deeper. Yeah.
something on the other side. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. And so I also like to hear how you said, just some of the things you said, you were doing a lot of things right, yet you were still struggling with insulin issues. And you also said that just like you and so many of your clients that you see, there's a big population of people who get missed by their practitioner because they do have an A1C and a fasting glucose that is absolutely from a doctor's perspective normal. You can even have that if you go with the optimal ranges. So I use, instead of using under 100 as okay blood sugar, I use around 70 or 72 to 85 as being more optimal. And you can still be a person who has perfect blood sugar but still have insulin resistance. And can you tell us why that is? Because I think some people are like, how is that even possible? Like, my blood sugar would have to be telling me the story, right?
Right. This is a common question I get almost every single day, and people just don't understand, and I didn't understand either. I'm like, I don't know what is going wrong here, but your body is so amazing in trying to keep homeostasis. So blood sugar is very tightly regulated. I know all your listeners are very savvy with this, but very tightly regulated. And if it goes too high, we basically pass out, go into a coma, and die. If it goes too low, the same thing can happen. So, and that, that tightness is a little bit different for every single person. But your body, if we as Americans and westernized culture, we've been taught to eat from the time we get up in the morning until the time we go to bed, and to eat a lot of grains. And our traditional breakfast foods are loaded with carbohydrates, simple carbohydrates, sugar. And so when you're eating that way from the time you get up in the morning, your body's like, it's like this huge rush of sugar. I mean, the sugar that we eat at breakfast time, if we're eating, it's not irregular to eat 100 to 150 grams of carbohydrate for a lot of people. That might be out there for our, our listeners, but a lot of people are taking that in and not blinking an eye. And they might be healthy carbs like fruits and oatmeal and yogurt, juice even. But your body's like, the blood sugar goes high. Your body's going to do everything it can to regulate that. And so you get a huge push of insulin. And you don't see the blood sugar highs, or they come out normal because your insulin response is taking care of those blood sugars. And like I said, your body just will tightly regulate that. And so over time, this just becomes problematic. And your insulin will be elevated long before blood sugars. Typically, sometimes it's years to decades. I mean, it can be 20 years that you have high insulin levels, struggling with your weight, not being able to figure out what is going wrong, but the blood sugars are coming out looking normal because your body's so amazing at not letting you die, basically. So if you're, and if you're just doing that over and over every day, it's just going to be, it's a nightmare for your pancreas. It's a nightmare for your digestive system. And I think too, when we're doing a lot of healthy things, like I was doing a lot of healthy things. I was getting exercise. I wasn't a drinker. I was eating somewhat healthy foods. I was getting outside as often as I could. And so for me, it was showing up much later. Like I'm in my late 40s. Is showing up later than somebody who was doing, lifestyle choices that weren't as healthy. But yeah, I mean, your body's going to regulate that blood sugar as quickly as it can and as tightly as it can. But the insulin can be high. And once our insulin levels are running high, that's where insulin resistance is basically high levels of insulin. For the reasons that I just talked about, but also the cells being resistant to the energy coming in. So it's kind of a double-edged sword where you have the high insulin, the cells aren't letting the energy in, and it just kind of sits in the bloodstream. But yeah, people don't know about it, and it's not tested. That's the really, really mind-boggling part, is just mainstream medicine hardly ever tests fasting insulin, and it's cheap. It's easy to draw, but it's not part of their standard of care. So, and they don't know how to interpret it. And that can be really frustrating for people for sure.
Yeah. What numbers do you use or do you look for in your practice with a fasting insulin number, which you just mentioned? It's not a typical thing a doctor would test for. So I've mentioned this on here before, that you definitely want to ask your doctor for this test. And there's a chance that they may say no, right? Have you had clients of yours say no? They said no? Yeah. And you can order this from Ulta Labs online. I have no affiliation, ULTA. You can get it for $26. So if your doctor refuses, you can order it on your own. And I'm sure there's other places you can do that, but that's just one that I happen to know of. So what are the numbers you look for?
Yeah, when I'm testing, people are looking at their lab results, and I have a lab I work with as well that sends home kits out for students who can't get it done on their own. But that's another great lab that to work with. But I look for like 2 to 6 as a normal healthy insulin. You don't want to have no insulin, that's not healthy either, but like 2 to 6 is a good reference range. 6 to 12 is kind of beginning insulin resistance. That's not as long standing. Usually in that range, sometimes people are pre-diabetic. It doesn't always correlate. But usually in that range, you can turn things around a little bit more quickly. It's not as severe.
Yeah.
Over 12 is where it's like, okay, that's pretty high. That's more long-standing insulin resistance, and that's more severe, the higher level of insulin. So that's getting more severe. And oftentimes when it's going past 12-ish, it takes a little bit longer to reverse. But the other thing, and I know you know this, and probably a lot of your listeners know this, but the reference ranges aren't accurate. And so you get your fasting insulin done and it comes back at 20, which is very insulin resistant. And the reference range might go up to 25. And there's just no predictability with that. And that is really frustrating too. And your doctor, if they're not educated with fasting insulin and insulin resistance, they'll say, "Oh, you're fine," whereas no, that's really high, and
Yeah.
so that's frustrating too. And I think usually they're using reference ranges for inpatient, which is completely different because you're usually really sick, your body's in very high stress mode. Those reference ranges, I don't know how they even got to be how they are, but they're not accurate at all.
Yeah, I mean, if they were, let's say, a sample size was the typical, pull
Hmm.
a couple of people off the street from the United States, maybe that's where that comes from because I have no idea. So I typically use like about, below 5. My insulin was actually 1.7 a bunch of times. So my practitioner was like, I think that's too low. I was like, well, I've been pretty low carb for a while. So I don't know. I feel like I feel decent. So I
Yes.
feel like that's okay. But yeah, so those lower numbers are really important. And then I always like to say that, above that we have insulin resistance. But if you are within this range of, let's say below 5 and you're experiencing reactive hypoglycemia, that is something that could potentially be caused from hypersensitivity to insulin. So some people have that, but most people, you're going to find these higher numbers being an issue. So it's great that now we know that we have to test our fasting insulin and that's an easy test that we can get. And so you explained to us what insulin resistance is, and you were saying how insulin can be creeping up for years or decades before there's a change in blood sugar because the body will just put more and more and more insulin. So now maybe you have 2 times the amount of insulin that a normal person has, but it's doing the same job of getting that blood sugar down into that healthy range. Then maybe you have 3 times, 4 times as much insulin, but it's doing its job, but it needs that much insulin to do the same job as whereas a healthy person would need a quarter of the amount. And so that's how the insulin can be trickling up for years before we finally see the blood sugar just like not be able to stay in range. The insulin can't get that sugar into the cell, out of the blood where it needs to go, and now the amount of sugar in the blood is starting to go up. So, and then you mentioned the cells. So from here, I guess, are there some classic signs of insulin resistance? You mentioned several that you had been experiencing, but if someone's like, do I have this? I haven't tested my numbers. What sort of symptoms might they be experiencing?
Yeah, there's a lot of physical symptoms, and then there's some things that you can measure. The physical symptoms that I see most often are just being hungry all the time because, like you said, that insulin level is high, but the cells are resistant to the energy coming in. So people are like eating and eating, but the energy's not getting into the cell. So your body still thinks you're hungry. So you have all of this extra fat to burn, so insulin resistance is really an access problem, like an energy access problem, where it's like it's just kind of locked away, which is super frustrating. So being hungry all the time, that can be a telltale sign. Craving carbohydrates for just the same reasons, you're just not utilizing that energy well. Your body's kind of forgotten how to tap into fat metabolism, especially if you are a high carb eater. So carb cravings, craving sugar, being weight loss resistant is another pretty, most people are struggling with weight loss resistance just for the same reasons. Like we just can't access our fat stores. And what can be really frustrating is, neither one of us focus on calories because calories don't dictate, you know, if we're going to store, the energy storage, like our hormones dictate that. So you can be eating a low calorie approach. You're only eating 1,200 calories a day, but you have high insulin and you're eating often and you're still like packing on weight. It's super frustrating. So weight loss resistance is a big one. And then some more advanced symptoms would be like being thirsty all the time. That's when you really have like high blood sugar and high insulin. Sleeping issues can be another sign of insulin resistance because your hormones are just once your insulin levels are unbalanced and off, all of the hormonal network, just they all talk to each other. So sex hormones start to get out of balance, and cortisol can get out of balance, and adrenal health can get out of balance. So all of a sudden you're not sleeping well, you're fatigued, you're being very tired, having energy crashes, especially in the afternoon after you've eaten a bigger meal. Again, it's an access problem. That blood sugar is climbing. Your body's like, oh my goodness, what do I do with this? Out goes a surge of insulin, and then you have a crash. And I know you talk a lot about this with reactive hypoglycemia, and it's a lot of the same symptoms, which is interesting. So low blood sugar and high blood sugar can have a lot of the same symptoms. But then another thing that people often struggle with insulin resistance is high blood pressure issues, and people think it's a salt issue. Like, I just need to cut back on my salt, and that's just such, that nutritional dogma just is so frustrating. But yeah, that's another thing, like high blood pressure, and then lipids. Some of the metrics that you can look at are like high triglycerides would be a telltale sign of metabolic issues, insulin resistance, low HDL, and then the high insulin would be telltale. And then another lab value to look at would be HSCRP, or C-reactive protein. That's kind of just an overall inflammatory marker. And it won't tell you where the inflammation is, but a lot of times when people are very insulin resistant, that is very elevated because you're just inflamed. So another physical sign would be like a puffy face, and just, looking bloated, feeling bloated because you're hanging on to extra water, you have a lot of carbohydrates stored, and you just can't access that energy that you're eating. So those are all symptoms of insulin resistance, which are very frustrating.
Yeah, that's a really good summary of so many symptoms. And I always like to say that it's not so obvious, right? Like, you wouldn't be like, oh, I have all these problems. It's like, it must be insulin resistance. So that's what we're trying to teach you. And hearing these symptoms over and over can really be helpful to have things sink in, because blood sugar and insulin issues, they affect every cell, organ, and process in our body. So they're sometimes non-specific, or they're not seemingly related because they're in different parts of the body. But it's those issues with the hunger, with the energy, with the sleep, with the hormones, and et cetera, that are really the ones that are showing up. So thank you so much for sharing that. So if someone is relating to these symptoms and frustrated because they feel like maybe they already eat healthy, they're watching what they do, like that was me. I was eating paleo when I found out I had insulin resistance and blood sugar issues. So on paper, I was eating a really healthy diet. I was eating clean. I was reading ingredients. I was doing the clean 15 and buying organic. And so what would you say to people like this who feel like they're trying a lot of things, but they're still craving, they're still overweight? Like, where would be a good place to start, or several places to start?
Yeah, the two top strategies that I teach to bring insulin levels down and to start to reverse insulin resistance would be intermittent fasting. And there's so many different fasting protocols that you can approach. And I really try to look at people's individual health issues, where they're at right now, because there can definitely be fasting protocols that shouldn't be followed for certain disease states, and certain ones that will work very well for certain disease states. And my fasting protocol is not necessarily your fasting protocol, and people like to ask me that all the time, like, well, what do you do for intermittent fasting? What do you eat? It's
What do
like,
you
well,
do? Yeah.
yeah. I'm on a maintenance protocol, and
Mm-hmm.
I've reversed my disease process. So that's going to look different than when I started. But intermittent fasting, and sometimes people are early intermittent fasters, sometimes they're later. And again, once you get to the point of maintenance, these things you don't have to implement all the time. But when you're trying to reverse a disease state, it's very different than when you're on the other side and in remission, so to speak, and reversed your disease process. So that's a strategy that I use. Sometimes people are like to shy away from that sometimes, and it's scary to them, and I get it. It's like, the thought of not eating breakfast to me was so absurd. It's like I don't understand this. And now I eat earlier than what I used to, and it just there's a lot of variables there. But sometimes some longer fasts can, for type 2 diabetics, fatty liver, PCOS, well, not so much PCOS, I don't do as many longer fasts, but prediabetes, those longer fasts can really help reverse the disease process. And again, they're not forever. Maybe 3 to 6 months, you do some longer fast to reverse that disease process. So that's one thing that I teach.
Shana,
And then,
Shana, can I pause you there for one second because I just want to pull out something important that you said, and you're talking about how there's protocols for healing versus a maintenance protocol. And that, I love your wording, and I'm going to steal this. I will credit you. But I really like that because I was even sharing today, like, I don't really share everything I do because people have that tendency of like, well, what are you doing? And it's like, we are all at different parts in our journey. What I'm doing now is not what I was doing in 2018 in February when I was, trying to get rid of my PCOS and trying to have normal periods and get rid of my acne and lose the weight. So it was very different. And what I did changed throughout that time. And so one of the things that I think is just important to extract from this is that there's not one way of doing things that you're going to finally figure out the one thing you need to do or like the one way you need to eat for the rest of your life. Like, we need to be aware of that. Our needs are going to change as our body heals, as we go into different seasons of our life, and as women going, through perimenopause and menopause, and like if it's summer versus winter, if we're active versus inactive, if it's before a period versus not, like there's so many different variables. And so I think it's really important to get that nuance that it's not as easy just to like come on here and be like, everybody should do this one fast. And that's not what you said, because you can't say it. We wish we could say that kind of stuff, right? And then what I will say is, in terms of, because I know I have a lot of people with low blood sugar who listen to this show, and fasting is not going to be appropriate yet. I had hypoglycemia and started keto with a 3-day fast. Don't do what I did. Don't do it, okay? It was terrible. I felt like I was, what did you say?
I said you were white knuckling it for sure.
Exactly. So that's what not to do, right? So if someone, and I personally love the idea of eating in the morning because it is more in sync with our circadian rhythms. So I personally, when I tell people to start fasting, I have them look at their dinner and maybe push it like a little bit earlier. What would be some of your earliest steps of like, how do I get started with fasting if I just want to move slowly and gently and give it a try? Like, what would that look like?
Yeah, when I'm working with students, there's like 3 things I have them start with. Because again, you have high insulin, you can't fast. Like, with reactive hypoglycemia, it's like, your blood sugars are gonna bottom out, and when you have high insulin, it's way too hard to fast very long times. So the first thing I have them do is pull out snacks. Like, just focus on 3 square meals that are protein centric and start to stabilize that blood sugar. So that's the first thing, is we pull out snacks. Like, I don't want you doing anything else, but just getting in 3 meals a day with no snacks. And then the second, just like you said, it's like, stop eating after dinner. Like, we can all do that. It might be hard at first, and sometimes it's like we say these things like, just don't eat after dinner, just don't snack, and it can be really challenging for people, but most of that is because your macronutrients are not balanced when you're eating your meals. So those are the first couple of things, is like no snacking, don't eat after bed, and then just try to either pull the dinner back earlier if that's appropriate for you, or eat a little bit later in the day. And I just did a podcast episode on this, like, is it better to fast through dinner or fast through breakfast? And both protocols can be very appropriate for people. It really just depends on your social schedule and then your disease states too. So for folks, like, I work with a lot of people with type 2 diabetes and fatty liver, they have really high morning blood sugars, kind of opposite of a lot of people that you're working with. So for them to fast throughout the morning and just work on burning out the liver glycogen and the extra energy stored in the muscle and the liver, and they have a higher circulating baseline blood sugar already, so it's appropriate for them to go a little bit longer and burn out that extra energy. But for somebody with adrenal issues or cortisol issues or thyroid issues or PCOS, their circadian rhythms are messed up. And so fasting through dinner might be way more helpful for you, just because that's going to help you to reestablish a normal circadian rhythm. And like you said, like, and the journey is so true. Like when I started intermittent fasting, I'm like, okay, I can't eat until noon. I can't eat until 1. It's like you put all these parameters on it. But I get up at before 6 in the morning. I exercise in the morning. And so for me, I've totally changed that because it makes more sense. And then just my normal biorhythm, my circadian rhythm is early. Like I'm asleep by 9:30 or 10 o'clock at night. So for me to eat a lot of food at the end of the day did not make sense to me. And then it's like you learn more about being more insulin sensitive earlier in the day or midday. And so you need to start matching that up. But I will say this too, it's like a lot of times when people are starting these approaches, their hormones are so out of balance, they don't really know when they're hungry, when they're full,
Yeah.
because our hormones are off. Our satiety, our hunger hormones, they're all just messed up. Our insulin is high, and so it's super frustrating. But yeah, I've changed. I now usually eat like not super early, but earlier than I used to. And I like to stop eating earlier than I used to. And when I first started to try to reverse my insulin resistance, I was doing 1 or 2 24-hour fasts a day and only eating one meal a day. Whereas now I very rarely do those because there's no need for them any
Yeah.
longer. And I would just, maybe every 3 to 6 months, I'd do like a 2-day fast. And again, very, very rare that I would do that now. But
Yeah.
the disease reversal process is different than the maintenance process for sure.
Yeah. So, in addition to well, maybe we can talk about a couple of different types of fasts besides just like the time restricted eating. You mentioned a 24-hour fast. What are some different types of fasts that people can play with? And then we'll go into that next thing that you recommend to people besides the fasting to get their insulin down.
Oh yeah, yeah. The therapeutic range of fasting is more like 36 to 42 hours. And if people have never tried intermittent fasting, that sounds really scary to them. Like, oh my gosh, a 36 to 42 hour fast. And again, those like I kind of set those fasts aside for people who are severely insulin resistant, and maybe the intermittent fasting or adding a 24-hour fast in here and there isn't doing it for the disease reversal process because they're very insulin resistant. So then the therapeutic range would be like 36 to 42 hours. And I wouldn't recommend that any more than a couple of times a week. And even one a week can make a huge change with your insulin sensitivity. And then like you mentioned, you need if you're menstruating, that's just a whole nother topic to look at. But that week before prior to your period, I don't recommend long fasts there. And then there's some other different types of fasts people can try. They can try like eating around 500 calories in, a higher protein meal that's mostly protein. If not eating at all seems just overwhelming, or you want to be with your family and eat, like there's just so many different approaches. And then there's approaches where you fast through breakfast one day, you fast through dinner the next day, so you're getting a little bit shorter fast, you're getting longer fasts in there. And then I do encourage people to pull back on fasting too, a day or two a week. And it's like it's not all about the fast, it's all about healing. And fasting protocols are healing protocols. So it's not like about food restriction or, reducing caloric intake. It's about letting your body heal in the times that it's not having to digest food. And that's a very important concept to grasp when you are approaching intermittent fasting at all. It's like it's for healing. It's not for restriction. It's not for seeing like how long I can go without eating. It's to let your body heal. And it's like a muscle, it's like it's gonna be really challenging at first, but it gets easier and easier.
Yeah.
Um,
What
yeah.
would you say? So, what are some benefits of fasting, and what is so healing about the not eating piece?
I lost you there for a minute.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes, now I can.
Okay, sorry. So, what are some other benefits of fasting, and what are those healing benefits that we can get?
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. There's things that happen for people with healing when they're fasting that they didn't set out to necessarily see that. It just kind of happens. But almost everybody that I work with who implements some sort of intermittent fasting, even if it's 12 to 14 hours. I mean, we're not talking about having to do 20 hours of fasting every single day, but they sleep better, they have higher energy, they're starting to, have better insulin sensitivity so that they have higher levels of energy. They just less brain fog, less fatigue, and it seems so counterintuitive when you eat less often that your energy is higher, and that we've been told the direct opposite, like eat all the time to keep your energy levels up, but that's just gotten us into so much trouble and just really a blood sugar nightmare. But those would be some of the big things: the insulin sensitivity, the better blood sugars, the skin issues a lot of times will improve too. That's another telltale sign of insulin resistance, is rashes, acne, whether or not it's insulin resistance or blood sugar spikes, just really leveling out the blood sugar and starting to resolve the insulin resistance will oftentimes improve skin issues, and of course body composition. It's like I don't like people to fixate on the scale and numbers, but measuring body composition especially can be very, very helpful. Um, so that those are some really, really big ones that people are get really excited about. And then a lot of times, again, we're fixating on weight. A lot of times people try this because they want to lose weight, but really what's happening is you're healing your body and you're letting your body get to a space of letting go of that weight and starting to burn your own body fat, because all of a sudden those hormone issues are resolving. So the weight loss is typically a side effect of getting the body healthier. So yeah, but there's just so many. And then I think a huge part, and probably the biggest benefit that I saw personally, because again, I didn't have a huge weight issue. My body composition improved. And like I mentioned, I'm almost 48 and my body composition is better than it was in my 20s and 30s. So that's a huge benefit. But another one is just the mental aspect. And it's like a lot of dietitians talk about food freedom, but I think there's different ways to look at food freedom. Like some people look at food freedom as, oh, I can eat whatever I want anytime and eat all the foods in moderation. But that's truly, to me, what food freedom is not thinking about food all the time and being satiated for 4, 5, 6 hours after a meal, not feeling bloated, not feeling, like you're thinking about the next meal as you're eating one meal and thinking like, oh, what am I going to eat my next meal? What is my next snack going to be? Or that used to be me. I used to have snacks in my car, like, oh, I'm running errands. I better have some snacks on hand because I might get hungry. Like I was terrified of getting hungry. And so that has been the biggest positive thing that's come out of intermittent fasting for me, is just the actual food freedom of not thinking about food all the time.
I couldn't agree more. I think that the intermittent fasting and that metabolic flexibility or the fat adaptation really starts to quiet that food noise. I always talk about my sugar dragon being making my decisions. I felt controlled by like, what are you going to eat, and just get the one thing that is small enough because you're going to eat the whole bag. And it was just like all this mental debate, and should I just have one more, and if I go work out then it was just nonstop. And that fear of being hungry, it's all of a sudden all that food noise just quiets, And it's like, oh, I have so much space to think about other things now. So you can start to do other things with your life. You can show up better with the people in your life, with your relationships, and you are much more even keeled. Your moods are better, your energy is better, your sleep is better. So you are showing up better in every single way. So it's a really amazing thing once you really dial this in and experience that benefit. So I fully agree. I love that benefit of fasting and metabolic health. So what would be the other, you said there's two things that you focus on when you want someone to help to improve their insulin, lower those insulin levels, improve the sensitivity. So you said time restricted eating, not snacking, some intermittent fasting could be one. What would be the other one?
Yeah, so the two main concepts, there's lots of concepts that I teach, but the two main ones would be intermittent fasting, time restricted eating, and the second one would be therapeutic carb restriction. And I like to use that concept, like that's the concept that I was trained for, using a low carb approach to actually reverse insulin resistance is therapeutic carb restriction. So again, people are like, oh, don't take my carbs away from me. I can't function. But when you have insulin resistance and metabolic disease, you are just not utilizing carbohydrates like you should be, kind of like in a broken metabolism, if you want to look at it that way, where the energy is just not getting utilized. You're constantly burning sugar. And like you said, like the fat adaptation is not there. So for type 2 diabetes, fatty liver, and pre-diabetes, we really need to pull back on carbohydrate intake. And again, it's not because carbs are inherently bad. Well, some are. I'm not going to be that dietitian who's going to tell you to eat all foods in moderation, because I don't believe that to be true.
And that's why you're
But
here on this show, because you're not like that. Yeah.
right. But it's just not truthful. I mean,
Yeah.
there are so many foods that are going to
Oh
make
yeah.
us ill.
Yeah.
But anyway, therapeutic carb restriction is scaling back on the carb intake because you're metabolically broken. So again, this is not something you need to implement forever, but I generally use a range, and I have a carb quiz that kind of helps people with this, but I generally use a range of like 25 carbs to 100 carbs, depending on where you are at. 100 might be a lot for a lot of people who are very ill. That's kind of the range that I'm at from day to day, again, in a maintenance strategy, and I can handle that amount of carbohydrates. But that amount of carbohydrates for someone who's really ill might be a blood sugar nightmare for a while. And so we might need to scale back to like less than 50 for a while. And I know you did a ketogenic approach for many months, regulated the blood sugar, got your insulin sensitivity back, and now you're able to handle a higher amount of carbohydrates. And that's always my goal for my students too. It's like, okay, yeah, we need to be, I don't even like to use the word restrictive. I like to say this is your therapy. Like you're showing up to your therapy just like you would show up for any other therapy. Like your fasting is a therapy and your carb restriction is a therapy for a while. So those are the two approaches that I use, and it's like I don't like to give any one amount to any one person. Like, okay, I'm going to start everybody at 25 grams of carbohydrate. Well, if you're at 400 grams of carbohydrate, you go down to 25, your body's going to be in shock and you're not going to feel good and you're going to quit and you're going to go back to your old ways. So we bring those carbohydrates down little by little when I work with students in my courses and individually. And then, sometimes they do need to be in more of that ketogenic range to see actual healing. And then, they heal themselves. They get to where they want to be, where they're feeling good, their labs. Like there's a couple of different things to look at. Like, have I healed from insulin resistance? Well, you can look at lab values. You can look at your physical symptoms is what I go off of. But then, yeah, usually you can tolerate some additional carbohydrates. I never want to condone, the packaged food. I'm not saying you can't ever have that, but that's not your end goal. Your end goal is never to go back to what got you sick in the first place, because you'll get sick again. I mean, there's no reason why you wouldn't. I mean, you got sick once from a certain lifestyle, from certain foods. you heal yourself, you go back to that, you're going to get sick again. And I'm sure, you and I see students that happens to um, too many times, but just because the environment is so hard, our everyday environment where we're at, it's really tough to, it's a lot harder than it should be to follow the strategies that we teach. But yeah, so those would be the two strategies would be the fasting protocols and the therapeutic carb restriction. And then we look at eating foods in a certain order too, just to regulate the blood sugar.
Yeah, absolutely. So those are great, and I use those as well. And I love that you're talking about these ranges and that, depending on where you're at, that's going to dictate where you're starting from or what your next step is. So that's the benefit of working with someone like you or someone like myself, where we can help guide you to, well, what is the next move that I make? Because you could be listening to a podcast and them say like, oh, I got all these benefits of eating in ketosis, but you're at 400 carbs, and then you drop to I've had people, followers of mine, say that they had gone to the hospital because they just tried these things on their own. And so it's a really big change to the body. So we want to make slow, sustainable changes, right? And not do what I did. Start with a 3-day water fast. Like, just do the opposite of what I do. Do what I say, not what I do, right? And so that can be really helpful. One of the biggest issues that I see when people are noticing, okay, I need to lower my carbs, and I know that protein is important, right? And what I'll see is that they will lower their carbs, they'll have some protein, but they also don't really have a lot of fat in their diet, because we've sort of had that residual leftover from the 80s and 90s fat phobia, like a little bit afraid to like eat all that. So it's very mild, like, oh, I cooked the chicken breast in butter. So we think that's like fat, right? And then what's happening is that they have no energy source, because protein is like this building block, and then carbs are energy and fat is energy. And so if you have low fat and then you pull the carbs down and you have low carbs, then you have low energy. And so it's like, oh, this doesn't work for me. I had no energy when I went low carb. Do you see that happen too?
I do, and I would say I would totally agree. Like the fat as the macronutrient is the hardest one to give people a range, because it's like I restrict the carbs for them because they're stuck in sugar burning. And we have a target of protein of about, I generally give women around 100 to 120 grams of protein. But I don't want to be calorie centric and be like, okay, we got to have our 1,500 calories. So now we're going to do 100 grams of fat. So fat is the hardest one, I would say, when people are like, well, how much fat do I take? And I shy away from giving them actual grams to shoot for. And I do more so, let's look at adding at least two serving, or at least two types of fat for every meal, and just see how you're feeling. And so the goal that I give my students is you should be able to go at least 4 hours without feeling hungry again. Optimally, more like 5 to 6. Like if you're truly having enough fat and you're having enough protein, because protein's satiating, but like you're saying, it's not as long burning. So you stay full, but it's not as long as if you would have had a fat, enough fat in your meals too. So it's such a fine line. So I usually say, like, let's start with like at least two fat sources per meal, whether it's avocado or eggs or butter or oil. And then we can play around with it, because the flip side of not getting too much fat is eating too, or not getting enough fat is eating too much fat. And people make that mistake on ketogenic diets a lot. It's like, oh, I can eat as much fat as I want. And it's like they're in ketosis, they're burning ketones, but they're having too much fat. And like you said, like fats are other energy source, and it makes you feel full. But sometimes people just get in the mindset of I can eat all the fat I want, and that can backfire on them too. So yeah, it's probably not the concrete answer that people want to hear, but it's just so gray. Like I do feel like of all of the macronutrients, that's the hardest one to give concrete suggestions for.
I couldn't agree more. Someone in my coaching program asked me yesterday, so okay, I have my carbs here, so how much fat do I eat? I'm like, I can't tell you that. I'm like, it sounds like an excuse, but I can't tell you. So yeah, utilizing how much fat should I eat? Make sure there's some types of fats on your plate. If you're doing a ketogenic diet, maybe you'd have like 3 or 4 types of fats on your plate. Maybe as you go through and you're like, okay, I'm really wanting to burn more of my own body fat, that's when we could taper the fat down a little bit. But having enough fat there to get you well through to the next meal, that and feeling satiated and not having food noise, those are really great tips, Shana, that I'm really thankful that you're sharing with us, because that's going to help us know, was that enough energy for my body? And we're going to need different amounts of energy during different days, right? So a day that I'm like a lazy Sunday where I'm watching Netflix and, on the couch, that's going to be a really different nutrient need than a day where I'm up and I'm podcasting and I went to the gym and I'm running errands and I'm hosting coaching calls. Like, my brain is burning all this energy and I'm running around and like physically moving. I'm going to need a lot more energy on those days. So knowing that there might be, if we're using it, there might be a range that we're eating in, right? So sometimes people are like, what is the exact amount of this macronutrient that I need? It's like, well, let's use a range, or like, let's be able to get so good at it that we could kind of eyeball a plate and be like, this is going to be a lazy day, or like, I'm not going to be moving that much today because I'm just sitting at my desk. So I'm going to do half the amount of fat that I normally would have, and, see if that works for you. So these are really good pieces of advice that we're trying to help you with, individualizing things to you as best as we can, in speaking in like general terms, right? It's tricky. And I love that recommendation of like really focusing on protein. Protein is the star. It is the building block. So the fat and carbs are just energy. They're sort of, we can play with those a little bit, but the protein is that like main pillar that really needs to be there. And that is so helpful for satiety and reducing cravings. Like you said earlier, the first thing you say is don't eat after dinner. And it's like one of the best ways we can get there. And I know that you have posts about this and everything, that is, we have to eat enough protein during the day at our meals so we can feel satiated. So if you're feeling snackish at night, turn around and say, how much protein did I have? And so what are some of your favorite sources of protein? If we could, talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, my go-tos are meat and eggs. I'm not gonna lie.
Same
And I know
here.
you have these questions, I'm sure, all the time. Like, can I follow your approach, or can I join your course if I'm vegetarian or vegan? I'm like, you can, but it's gonna be really challenging for you to meet your protein goals.
Yeah.
And people just need to understand that animal foods are very different from plant foods as far as protein goes. Plant foods don't have all of your amino acids that you need. They're not absorbed and utilized in the same way as animal protein is. Like, people just need to realize, well, if we look at gram for gram of 50 grams of animal protein versus 50 grams of plant protein, they're the same amount in grams, but they're not going to be utilized and absorbed and processed and get into our cells and build things like animal protein is going to do. And I used to think I should eat more plants than protein and animal foods. But definitely meat and eggs are my go-tos. I eat those every single day. We're blessed to have our own chickens, and I eat chicken eggs almost every day. I haven't developed a sensitivity to it yet, so
Good for you, because I'm back off eggs.
and
I'm
then
on
I
and
do
off.
eat a fair amount of, like, I'll eat like pumpkin seeds, and nuts work for some people. Not everybody. And
Yeah,
then
I
like
think of those more as a fat source. They have that
yeah,
incidental protein, but
yeah,
because they're a plant, I like to store them in my mind as like a fat. So, and I'm sure you do too, as like in terms
yes,
of, they'll add a little bit, but it's like a condiment versus it's like, putting salt on your steak, or like steak sauce
sure.
versus the actual steak, right? So we're getting like little bits of different flavors and different nutrients and different benefits. But I wouldn't eat a whole meal of like pumpkin seeds, right? I have to eat
Right,
so many.
right,
So yeah.
right. Right. And
Yeah.
then my other go-tos, I'm not dairy intolerant. I tolerate dairy very well. Not
Ah,
everybody does, but I Greek yogurt and cottage cheese would be my other go-tos. But yes, meat or eggs in pretty much every meal. I only eat 2 meals a day generally.
mhm.
It's pretty rare that I eat three, just because I eat so much protein in one meal that I'm not hungry for 3 meals. But every once in a while, if we're traveling or I'm not eating my
Yeah.
normal, then I will eat 3 meals just because I didn't get the protein. Jerky is another thing that I love. Fish, of course, seafood if you can tolerate those. But yeah,
Yeah.
those are my favorites. Those are my go-tos.
Yeah.
I'm not a big peanut butter or nut butter fan just because, and, you know, it depends on the product, but a lot of people just don't digest those very well and they think they're really high protein, but like you said, they're more of a
Yeah.
fat than a good protein source.
Yeah, exactly. So thank you so much for sharing all those. I, agree with those protein sources and having our meals just centered around those and adding some veggies and whatever carb level you're at that and just playing with it and seeing what feels good. But I mean, if people really took that advice of prioritizing high quality animal protein at every meal, we wouldn't see so many people here. So that is like such a good takeaway that you're sharing with people. And then if you're able to take out snacks, if you're hypoglycemic, you won't be able to do that yet. But that is what we're going to work towards because that's how you heal. So this idea that we're not built to eat around the clock, where we need to give our digestive system a break. It's going to help our blood sugar. It's going to help us sleep better. So our modern lifestyle is just such the opposite of what would be healthy for our bodies. So thank you so much for sharing. Where can people contact you? How can they work with you? Tell us all about your that information, and I will be sure to link everything in the show notes.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me today. This has been a really fun conversation.
Yeah.
But my podcast is called Fast to Heal Stories. Very much centers around insulin resistance and reversing the disease process of insulin resistance. I've had Danny on a couple of times. So, or actually you're coming up. We're interviewing
Yeah.
you again. So that will be your second episode. Tons of information there. I'm very active on Instagram. That's my go-to social platform. I'm not as good at the
Me
other
either.
one.
Me
And
either.
I
I'm
try
stuck in
to
Instagram, Bill.
communicate with people on Instagram. So that's
Yes.
why I like it. But it's just my name at shana.hussin.rdn. And then my website is fasttoheal.info. And I have a number of different courses there that people can enroll in for extra help.
Awesome. Love it. Thank you so much for being here and taking the time to chat with everybody today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.